You know that moment when everything you thought you knew about your life just shatters? When the sound of breaking glass becomes the sound of your world falling apart. That's what happened to me on a Tuesday night in October at my own dinner table in the home I'd built with love and sacrifice over 37 years. My name is Margaret Wells. I spent 25 years as a family court judge, believing that justice and compassion could coexist, that respect was something you earned and gave freely. I thought I understood human nature, thought I could read people like the legal briefs I'd studied for decades. I was wrong about so many things. That night, my daughter-in-law threw a wine glass at my face when I refused to pour her another drink. The glass shattered against my cheek, and red wine ran down like blood, staining the white tablecloth and everything I believed about family, about respect, about the difference between love and enabling. My son Ethan froze mid-breath, fork halfway to his mouth, and Clara, she actually smirked. When I ask, you obey, she said, like I was nothing more than hired help in my own home. I realized in that moment, with wine and blood mixing on my cheek, that I was no longer the mother at that table. I wasn't even a guest. I was the servant, and I had been for months without even knowing it. Before I tell you how I turned that night of humiliation into a fight for justice, not just for me, but for my son who was drowning and didn't even know it, make sure you're subscribed to this channel. And please, tell me in the comments where you're watching from, because every parent, every person who's ever felt their dignity slipping away in their own home, needs to hear this story. They need to know how quickly love can turn into manipulation, and how sometimes the bravest thing you can do is refuse to be broken. The evening had started so differently. Soft jazz played from the speakers in my dining room, the same room where I'd hosted Christmas dinners and birthday celebrations, where I'd taught Ethan to set a proper table when he was 8 years old. The silverware caught the light from the flickering candles, and everything looked perfect from the outside. But isn't that always how it is? The most beautiful facades hide the deepest rot. Ethan and Clara had moved in temporarily 6 months earlier. That's what they called it, temporary. Clara had lost her job, they said. Just until she got back on her feet. Just until they saved enough for their own place. The road to hell, as they say, is paved with just untils. I had been a judge for over 2 decades. I'd seen families torn apart by addiction, by abuse, by financial ruin. I thought I could spot the warning signs from a mile away. But when it's your own family, when it's your son's happiness on the line, you make excuses. You tell yourself that love means overlooking the small things, that patience is a virtue, that family comes first. You convince yourself that the uncomfortable feeling in your stomach is just you being judgmental, that you're overreacting, that you need to try harder to understand. The dinner table had become a symbol of false peace. We'd sit there 3 nights a week, making small talk about the weather, about the news, about anything except the growing tension that filled the room like smoke. Clara would arrive late most nights, already carrying that loose-limbed casualness that comes with pre-dinner drinks. She'd mutter about her job interviews, about how employers treat applicants like maids, about how the world didn't appreciate her talents. I should have known then. I should have heard my own words echoing back to me when she said that word, maid, with such venom. I didn't know I'd soon hear it directed at me. The disrespect had been building for weeks, but it was so subtle at first. A rolled eye when I'd suggest we say grace. A heavy sigh when I'd mention the house rules about dishes. Little comments that felt like pinpricks, individually harmless, but collectively designed to undermine my authority in my own home. Maybe judges forget how to listen once they retire, she'd said just the week before, when I'd asked her to keep the music down after 10 p.m. Ethan had laughed nervously, that forced laugh children make when they're trying to keep peace between warring parents. But I wasn't warring. I was just trying to maintain some semblance of order, some basic respect in the home I'd worked my entire life to build. That Tuesday night, Clara interrupted every topic of conversation with sarcasm. When I mentioned the beautiful autumn leaves, She rolled her eyes and said, "Must be nice to have time to notice trees." When Ethan talked about a project at work, she cut him off with, "Nobody cares about your boring office drama." When I tried to steer the conversation toward her job search, she snapped, "Not everyone can coast on a pension, Margaret." Not mom. Not mother. Margaret. Like I was a stranger she barely tolerated. I watched her pour glass after glass of wine, the expensive bottle I'd been saving for a special occasion. The third refill should have been my signal to intervene, but I'd spent 6 months walking on eggshells, 6 months telling myself that confrontation would only make things worse. I watched the bitterness grow with each sip, watched her eyes get glassy and mean. "Another pour, please, Mother," she said, raising her empty glass with that smirk I'd come to dread. The word mother dripped with mockery, like she was humoring a child playing dress-up. "You've had enough, Clara." For words. For simple words that lit the fuse to 6 months of accumulated rage. The sound of shattering glass is something you never forget. It happens in slow motion and lightning fast at the same time. I saw her arm draw back, saw the crystal tumbler leave her hand, saw Ethan's face contort in horror as he realized what was happening. The glass hit my cheek with the sharp crack of breaking, and then the wine was everywhere, red and spreading like a wound across the white tablecloth I'd pressed that morning, across my blouse, down my neck. The silence that followed was deafening. Ethan's shout, "Clara, what the hell?" seemed to come from underwater. But under that, the quiet was enormous. Silence can be louder than violence sometimes. It can fill a room and press down on you until you can't breathe. I touched my cheek and felt the wetness, blood and wine mixing together, warm and sticky. A small cut from a shard of glass, nothing that would leave a permanent scar on my skin. But the other kind of scar, the invisible kind that forms when someone breaks something precious inside you, that was already forming. "Leave my table," I whispered. Clara laughed. Actually laughed. "You're not the queen of this house, Margaret. You're just an old woman who can't accept that things change." She stormed off, her heels clicking against the hardwood floors I'd refinished myself 10 years ago. Ethan remained frozen, his napkin still clutched in his hand, torn between love and shame, between the woman he'd married and the mother who'd raised him. The shattered glass on my dining room floor wasn't just broken crystal. It was broken boundaries, broken respect, broken illusions about what family meant. As I bent to pick up the pieces, I realized I was also picking up the shattered remains of my patience. That night, I sat in my study until 3 in the morning. The same study where I'd written countless legal opinions, where I'd prepared for trials that would determine the fate of other families. The bandage on my cheek pulled tight when I moved, a constant reminder of what had happened just hours before. I opened my old leather notebook, the one I'd used for case notes throughout my career, and began to write. Not with the emotional fury you might expect, but with the calm precision of someone who'd spent decades documenting truth. I wrote down every detail, the time, the witnesses, the exact words spoken. I photographed the table, the stained tablecloth, the shards of glass still glinting under the dining room light. In court, I'd defended strangers for years. That night, I defended myself. The decision to press charges wasn't born from revenge. It came from a place deeper than anger. It came from the recognition that respect isn't optional, that dignity isn't negotiable, that sometimes love means setting boundaries even when it breaks your heart. I'd spent my career watching families destroy themselves by enabling bad behavior, by choosing temporary peace over lasting change. I opened my filing cabinet and pulled out a manila folder. With my old label maker, I typed, "Incident, Dining Room, October 22nd. The sound of the label printing reminded me of countless case files, countless families who'd sat in my courtroom hoping for justice. Now it was my turn to seek it. Dawn came gray and cold. Officer Harris arrived at 7 a.m. sharp, his patrol car looking strange and official in my driveway where Ethan had learned to ride his bicycle, where Clara parked her red convertible, the one she somehow afforded despite being unemployed. "Mrs. Wells," Officer Harris said, removing his cap. He was young, maybe Ethan's age, with kind eyes that reminded me why I'd always respected law enforcement. "You reported an assault?" I recounted the events with the same measured tone I'd used in courtroom testimony for 25 years. My composure seemed to unnerve him. He'd probably expected tears, hysterics, the emotional breakdown that would make this easier to categorize and file away. But I'd learned long ago that truth speaks loudest when delivered calmly. "Ma'am," he said, glancing at his notepad, "are you sure you want to pursue this? Sometimes family disputes can be worked out without involving the courts." Before I could answer, Clara appeared at the top of the stairs, disheveled but defiant. "You called the cops over spilled wine," she called down, her voice still carrying that mocking tone that had become her signature. "Jesus, Margaret, what's next?" "Calling the FBI because I used the wrong fork." Ethan stumbled down behind her, his hair messy, his face gray with exhaustion and something deeper, shame, maybe, or the dawning realization that his wife wasn't who he thought she was. "Mom, please," he begged, his voice cracking like it had when he was 12 and had broken my favorite vase playing ball in the house. She didn't mean it. She was drunk. People make mistakes. I looked at my son, this man I'd raised to be kind and good and honest, and saw him making excuses for behavior he never would have tolerated from anyone else. I saw him shrinking into himself, making himself smaller to accommodate her explosive anger. "Intent doesn't erase impact, Ethan," I said, using the words I'd spoken to countless defendants over the years. And this wasn't a mistake. This was a choice. Clara was taken for questioning. As Officer Harris guided her toward the patrol car, she turned back and looked at me with such pure hatred that I felt it like a physical blow. "You'll regret this, you miserable old bitch," she hissed. "I'll make sure of it." Ethan's faith in me began to crumble that morning. I could see it in the way he wouldn't meet my eyes, in the way he flinched when the patrol car door slammed shut. He'd chosen sides without even realizing it, and it wasn't mine. After the patrol car pulled away, silence swallowed my home whole. It was a different silence than the one that had followed the breaking glass. This was emptier, more complete. It was the silence of consequences, of bridges burned, of love tested and found wanting. I walked through my house, the house I'd bought 37 years ago when Ethan was just a baby, the house where I'd raised him alone after his father left, and every room echoed with absence. The dining room still smelled like wine and broken dreams. The kitchen still had 2 coffee cups on the counter from yesterday morning, when we'd all pretended things were normal. The echo of that glass breaking was quieter now than the absence of my son's voice. He'd gone to stay with Clara's sister, he'd told me in a text message. He needed time to think, he said. Time to figure out how to fix what I'd broken. What I'd broken. As if I was the one who'd thrown the glass. As if I was the one who'd shattered the peace with violence and disrespect. I sat in my empty living room and wondered if justice was worth this loneliness spreading through the walls like fog. I'd upheld the law, protected my dignity, done what any reasonable person would do when assaulted in their own home. So why did it feel like I was the one being punished? The house felt bigger without them. Every sound seemed amplified, the hum of the refrigerator, the tick of the grandfather clock, the settling of old wood. These were the sounds that had comforted me when I lived alone before, but now they felt accusatory, like witnesses to my failure as a mother. I'd spent my career making difficult decisions, weighing justice against mercy, law against love. But nothing had prepared me for this, for choosing between enabling my son's destruction and risking his rejection. For drawing a line in the sand and watching him step over to the other side. 3 days later, my phone buzzed with a credit alert. A purchase for $3,000 at a jewelry store I'd never heard of, charged to an account under my name that I'd never opened. My hands shook as I stared at the notification. This wasn't just about a thrown glass anymore. This wasn't just about disrespect at my dinner table. I called Daniel Klein, a former police investigator I'd worked with during my years on the bench. If anyone could untangle this mess, it was Daniel. He had that particular skill that good investigators possess, the ability to find patterns where others see only chaos. "Margaret," he said when I explained the situation, his voice carrying that careful neutrality that professionals use when they're trying not to alarm you. "This credit alert. It's not unusual for domestic situations to have financial components. Would you like me to take a look?" 2 days later, Daniel sat in my living room with a thick manila folder spread across my coffee table. His face was grim as he laid out printouts, bank statements, credit applications, a paper trail of deception that stretched back months. "You're not just dealing with temper, ma'am," he said, his voice quiet and serious. "This woman's patterns look deliberate, calculated." The evidence was overwhelming. Clara had opened multiple credit accounts using Ethan's social security number. Luxury purchases, designer clothes, expensive dinners, hotel stays, all charged to cards he didn't know existed. She'd forged his signature on loan applications, used his identity to finance a lifestyle that neither of them could afford. "Look at this," Daniel said, sliding a printed email across the table. "She sent this to someone named Rick 3 weeks ago." I read the words twice before they sank in. "The old woman won't live forever. The house will be worth at least $800K. Just need to keep Ethan convinced that Mommy Dearest is the problem." My hands trembled as I set the paper down. This wasn't drunken disrespect. This wasn't even about control or anger. This was a plan. A calculated, long-term plan to isolate my son, inherit my home, and destroy anyone who stood in her way. The courthouse felt different when you were on the wrong side of the bench. I'd spent 25 years looking down from that elevated position, weighing evidence, making decisions that would alter the course of people's lives. Now I sat in the witness stand, my voice steady, but my heart racing as I recounted the events of that Tuesday night. Judge Patricia Chen presided, a woman I'd mentored when she was a young prosecutor. The irony wasn't lost on me. I'd taught her to be thorough, to consider all angles, to show compassion without compromising justice. Now she was applying those lessons to my case. "Mrs. Wells," she said, her voice carrying the formal tone that courtrooms demand, "please tell the court what happened on the evening of October 22nd. I told my story. The whole story. The months of escalating disrespect, the financial manipulation we'd discovered, the glass that shattered more than just crystal. I spoke with the same measured precision I'd used for decades, but underneath, my heart was breaking. Clara sat at the defendant's table in a conservative dress she'd probably bought with stolen credit, her hair pulled back, looking nothing like the woman who'd screamed at me in my own home. She'd cleaned up well for court, but I could see the rage simmering beneath the surface. When Judge Chen issued the restraining order and sentenced Clara to 6 months of community service, Clara's composure finally cracked. The smirk disappeared, replaced by something cold and calculating. "This isn't over," she mouthed at me as the bailiff led her away. Ethan sat in the back row, trying to make himself invisible. He wouldn't look at me, wouldn't acknowledge his mother who'd just been vindicated by the very system he'd always claimed to respect. When I turned to leave, he was already gone. The confrontation happened outside the courthouse, under the gray October sky that seemed to match my mood. Ethan was waiting by my car, his face twisted with anger and pain. "You've destroyed my marriage," he said, his voice breaking. "You've destroyed everything." "I only stopped your destruction," I replied, but the words felt hollow. "How do you explain to your child that saving them sometimes feels like losing them?" "She loves me, Mom. She made mistakes, but she loves me." Love doesn't forge signatures, Ethan. Love doesn't steal. Love doesn't throw glasses at your mother. You're jealous, he said, and the words hit me harder than any glass could have. You're jealous that I found someone, that I'm not your little boy anymore. I wanted to show him the evidence Daniel had gathered. I wanted to spread it all out on the hood of my car and make him see what I saw. But you can't force someone to accept truth they're not ready for. You can only hope that eventually reality will break through their denial. He moved out with Clara that afternoon. I watched from my window as they loaded boxes into a red convertible, boxes of belongings from my house, from the room I'd kept ready for him since he was 18. The silence that filled my home afterward wasn't just empty, it was profound, like the quiet after a storm when you're still not sure what survived. I spent the next weeks replaying our conversation, wondering if I could have said something different, something that would have reached him. But every time I closed my eyes, I saw that email. The old woman won't live forever. Every time I started to doubt myself, I remembered the sound of breaking glass and the way Clara had smiled when wine and blood ran down my face. 2 weeks later, Daniel returned with another file. This one was thicker, heavier, full of discoveries that made my stomach turn. Bank records showing systematic theft. Text messages between Clara and various men, each one a mark in her elaborate cons, photos of her at expensive restaurants while claiming to search for work. Margaret, Daniel said, his voice heavy with something that might have been pity, there's something else you need to see. He handed me a printed text conversation between Clara and someone named Marcus. The timestamps showed it was from just 2 days ago. Clara, plans working perfectly. The sun's completely turned against her now. Marcus, and the house. Clara, soon. She's old, he's weak. Won't be long before it's ours. Marcus, what about the restraining order? Clara, restraining orders are just paper. She won't live forever. I read the messages 3 times before the full impact hit me. This wasn't just about money or manipulation. This was about elimination. Clara wasn't just planning to steal from me, she was planning to outlast me. There's more, Daniel said quietly. Her real name isn't Clara Mason. It's Claire Masterson. She's got a record in 3 states: fraud, identity theft, elder abuse. Your son isn't her first victim. The photos he showed me could have been from different lives entirely. Clara with different hair, different names, always attached to older men or their children. Always targeting families with assets, with property, with something worth stealing. She's done this before, I whispered. Multiple times. And it doesn't usually end well for the families involved. That night, I sat in my study and tried to make sense of it all. My son, my brilliant, kind, trusting son, had been targeted by a professional predator. She'd studied him, learned his weaknesses, crafted herself into exactly what he needed. The grieving young man who'd lost his father too early, who'd always felt responsible for everyone else's happiness, who couldn't bear to see someone he loved in pain. She'd played him like a violin, and now he was so deep in her web of lies that he couldn't see the truth even when it was documented in black and white. The call came at 2:47 a.m. on a Thursday night in November. I know the exact time because I was staring at my bedside clock, unable to sleep, when my phone rang. Ethan's name on the screen made my heart race. Mom? His voice was small, broken, like he was 12 years old again and had woken up from a nightmare. I'm here, sweetheart. I think I need help. 20 minutes later, he was standing on my doorstep. His left eye was swollen shut, his lips split, his shirt torn. But the worst damage wasn't physical. It was the way he held himself, hunched and defeated, like a man who'd been systematically destroyed from the inside out. I didn't ask questions. I didn't say, I told you so. I just guided him to the couch and brought ice for his face and sat with him while he shook with the aftermath of whatever had happened. She hit me, he finally whispered. She's been hitting me. For months. My heart broke, not just for his pain, but for the silence he'd maintained. How many nights had he gone to bed with bruises? How many times had he made excuses, covered up marks, convinced himself that love sometimes hurt? When the one you love becomes the one you fear, I said quietly, denial is the last thing to leave. He stayed that night, sleeping in his old room for the first time in months. I heard him crying through the walls, deep, painful sobs that spoke of more than physical injury. He was mourning the death of his dreams, the end of his marriage, the realization that everything he'd believed about Clara was a lie. The silence in my house that night wasn't lonely anymore. It was protective, healing, safe. It was the silence of truth finally acknowledged, of pretense finally abandoned. The violation of the restraining order came 3 days later. I was in the kitchen making coffee when the hammering started, violent, persistent pounding on my front door that seemed to shake the entire house. "Open this door, you miserable bitch." Clara's voice was raw with rage and desperation. "You turned him against me. You poisoned his mind." I called 911 with steady hands, my voice calm as I reported the violation. Through the window, I could see her. Hair wild, makeup smeared, looking nothing like the composed woman who'd once sat at my dinner table. This was who she really was, a predator cornered, a con artist whose marks had finally seen through her game. "I know you're in there," she screamed. "This isn't over. You think you've won, but you haven't won anything." The police arrived within minutes. I watched from my living room window as they arrested her again, this time with less politeness, less patience. She fought them, screaming threats and accusations that grew more incoherent as they loaded her into the patrol car. Ethan watched from behind the curtains, trembling but safe. When the patrol car disappeared down the street, I put my arm around his shoulders. "It's over now, son," I whispered. But even as I said it, I wondered if it ever really ended. If the damage done by someone like Clara ever fully healed, or if it just scarred over, leaving weak spots that might crack under pressure years later. The rebuilding took time. Not just of trust between Ethan and me, but of his sense of self, his ability to make decisions, his faith in his own judgment. Clara had systematically undermined all of these things, convinced him that he was weak, stupid, unable to function without her guidance. We started small. We repainted the dining room together, covering the wall where the wine had stained it. "Sky blue," Ethan suggested, like the morning after a storm. The symbolism wasn't lost on either of us. We were washing away the ugliness, starting fresh, choosing hope over fear. We changed the locks on all the doors. We closed the fraudulent credit accounts and dealt with the financial mess Clara had created. We planted new roses in the front garden, replacing the ones she'd trampled during her final rage. Each small act of restoration felt like reclaiming our home, our lives, our future. Slowly, carefully, Ethan began to remember who he was before Clara. The man who'd graduated summa cum laude from law school. The man who'd always stood up for underdogs, who'd chosen public service over private practice because he believed in justice. The man I'd raised to be strong and kind and good. 6 months after Clara's final arrest, Ethan came to me with an idea. He wanted to start a foundation, something small at first, but with the potential to grow. A resource for male victims of domestic and financial abuse, men who were too ashamed to seek help, who didn't even recognize their own victimization. "I want to call it the Blue Table Foundation," he said. After our dining room. After the place where everything changed. His first speaking engagement was at a community center downtown. I sat in the front row, tears blurring my vision as I watched my son, my strong, brave son, tell his story to a room full of strangers. "My name is Ethan Wells," he began, his voice steady despite the tremor in his hands. "And I want to tell you about the night a broken glass saved my life." He talked about manipulation disguised as love, about financial abuse hidden behind claims of financial hardship, about how predators target empathy and use it as a weapon, about how asking for help isn't weakness, it's the first step toward strength. I want to dedicate this talk, he said, looking directly at me, to my mother, who taught me that love and law can coexist. That sometimes the most loving thing you can do is refuse to enable someone's destruction. That dignity isn't negotiable, especially when you're dealing with family. The applause that followed was long and heartfelt, but it couldn't match the pride that filled my chest. My son was back. Damaged, scarred, forever changed, but back. Clara pleaded guilty to multiple felony charges and was sentenced to 5 years in prison. The judge, not Patricia Chin this time, but another colleague from my years on the bench, didn't mince words during sentencing. Ms. Masterson, he said, using her real name, you've shown a pattern of predatory behavior that spans multiple states and multiple victims. You've weaponized trust, turned love into a tool for theft, and caused immeasurable harm to families who welcomed you with open hearts. I wasn't in the courtroom for her sentencing. I'd said my piece during the trial, given my testimony, provided my evidence. My role in Clara's story was finished. Now it was time to focus on my role in Ethan's recovery, in my own healing, in building something positive from the wreckage she'd left behind. But I did read the victim impact statements from her previous marks. Elderly men who'd lost their life savings. Adult children who'd watched their parents disappear into financial ruin. Families torn apart by a woman who saw love as weakness and trust as opportunity. One statement, from a man in Arizona whose father had been Clara's victim 2 years earlier, stayed with me. She didn't just steal money. She stole our faith in our own judgment. She made us question everything we thought we knew about protecting the people we love. That was Clara's true crime, not the fraud or the theft or even the violence. It was the way she made good people doubt their own goodness, made loving people afraid to love, made trusting people suspicious of everyone who came after her. The Blue Table Foundation grew faster than either of us expected. Ethan started with a simple website and a phone number, but within a year, he was fielding calls from across the country. Men who'd been financially abused by partners. Adult children who'd watched predators isolate and manipulate their elderly parents. Families who'd been torn apart by someone they'd welcomed with open arms. I helped when I could, offering legal advice, making connections with resources in other states. But mostly, I watched my son transform his pain into purpose, his trauma into triumph. He'd taken the worst experience of his life and used it to help others avoid the same fate. You know what the hardest part is? He asked me one evening as we sat in our sky blue dining room, eating dinner at the same table where everything had changed. It's not the shame or the embarrassment. It's forgiving myself for not seeing it sooner. You saw what she wanted you to see, I replied. That's what predators do. They're experts at manipulation. The fact that you trusted someone you loved doesn't make you weak. It makes you human. I should have listened to you. You listened when you were ready to hear. That's all any of us can do. 2 years later, the foundation had helped over 300 families. Ethan had testified before state legislatures about the need for better laws protecting domestic abuse victims regardless of gender. He'd been featured in national magazines, interviewed on television, invited to speak at conferences across the country. But the moment that mattered most to me was smaller, quieter. It was a Tuesday evening in October, exactly 2 years after the night that changed everything, when Ethan brought me a letter from a man in Oregon. Dear Mr. Wells, it read, I'm writing to thank you for saving my father's life. When I heard you speak about financial abuse, I recognized everything that was happening in my family. Thanks to your advice, we were able to stop a woman who was systematically stealing from my 78-year-old father. She's now in prison, and my dad is safe. But more than that, our family is together again. My father doesn't blame himself anymore for being foolish enough to fall for her tricks. He knows now that falling in love doesn't make you foolish, it makes you human. Ethan's eyes were wet as he finished reading. Do you think it was worth it, Mom? All the pain, all the fighting, all the time we lost. I looked around our dining room. The walls we'd painted together, the table where we now shared honest conversations instead of polite small talk, the window where sunlight streamed through and painted everything golden. I think I said carefully that broken things can be mended stronger than they were before. I think that sometimes you have to lose everything to find out what actually matters. And I think that the worst night of our lives became the first night of something better. The Blue Table Foundation still operates today. Ethan remarried 2 years ago, a wonderful woman named Sarah who loves him for exactly who he is, scars and all. They're expecting their first child in the spring, and yes, I'm going to be a grandmother. The thought fills me with joy and terror in equal measure, joy at the new life coming, terror at the responsibility of protecting another generation from predators like Clara. But that's what love is, isn't it? It's terror and joy mixed together. It's the willingness to be vulnerable, to trust, to hope, even after you've been burned. It's the courage to keep setting the table even after someone has thrown glasses and shattered your peace. I still think about that night sometimes. About the sound of breaking glass, about the wine spreading like blood across my white tablecloth, about the moment I realized that staying silent wasn't keeping the peace, it was enabling my own destruction. A single dinner destroyed our peace, but it rebuilt our truth. That glass didn't just cut my skin, it cut through the illusion that silence keeps families together. It shattered the myth that love means accepting disrespect, that family means tolerating abuse, that peace is worth preserving at any cost. If you've ever stayed quiet to keep the peace, remember this. Peace built on fear is just another kind of prison. Real peace comes from respect, from honesty, from the courage to stand up for yourself even when it costs you everything you thought you wanted. Sometimes the most loving thing you can do is refuse to be broken. Sometimes a broken glass can save your life. Sometimes the end of everything you knew is the beginning of everything you needed. Sometimes justice and love really can coexist, not in spite of the pain, but because of it.